Hi, everyone. We're here today for our next lecture on understanding the microbiome with fats and keto diets as the topic of the day. And I'm here in the SSIHI kitchen as part of UCI Culinary Health, and Chef Jess is in action. You can see her there. Hi, Jess. Did you want to say something?
Yes. Can you hear me? Everyone
Yeah,
can hear me, right? Nice.
yeah.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. Welcome back. And this will be a really fun talk about fats. And so I'm going to hand it over to Katrina. Go for it.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, you can see my image of a keto diet here, and it does not look like a carnivore diet. You'll see I'm still trying to lean into plant-based foods, and I'm still aiming to help everyone fill the fiber gap that we all have in the United States. So I'm looking forward to telling you a little bit about the history of keto diets, the medical conditions that we have now a century of data of how people have been helped by keto diets. And just in general, what are fats and what are macronutrients? We're going to cover all of that. So if you look here, we've got the series of lectures that we've done in the last year. The recordings are all available on the website at the Susan Samueli Integrative Health Institute website. There's recordings and recipes, and even today's recipes, which were actually sent in an email yesterday, they are also available on the website if you scroll down. So I want to start with just this crisis that we're facing, that the vast majority of Americans are not metabolically healthy. And globally, people eating processed foods and, basically once people have had access to supermarkets, we've seen these big changes in metabolic health. It's even been estimated that only 12% of Americans can be considered metabolically healthy. And to define what I mean by metabolic health, I mean, it's almost a philosophical question to ask, what is health? There's a lot of ways to be healthy, and I don't know that these biomarkers are the end-all definition. However, one way that we assess if someone is metabolically healthy is by looking at their blood sugar responses, their triglyceride levels, the size and concentration of different types of lipoproteins and cholesterol, like high-density lipoproteins and cholesterol, our blood pressure, our waist circumference. And this is all, how people are doing without the use of medications. And as many of you know, the most commonly prescribed medication in the world are statins like Lipitor. And so this is a problem that's affecting a lot of people. Here's an example. This is actually from the UK. These numbers are already higher in the US, but as you can see, if trends persist, we've got about a third of people defined as obese and about 10% of people developing type 2 diabetes. Another part of this crisis that I want to make sure we pay attention to is that you might think of alcohol as causing liver disease, but actually sugar has really big impact, especially the forms that we consume it in a lot in the United States. We eat a lot of high fructose corn syrup, especially in sodas. And those fructose molecules can be converted to fat very quickly in our livers. And so in the last couple decades, it's become clear that there's a lot of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And so this is just a public health message that it's really important to think about your liver health, and it's invisible. It's hard to tell how it's going. And so this is just, I want everyone to know that the sugar can really affect your liver health. And the best things to do are to do your best to eat minimally processed foods, so avoiding processed foods, and eating the rainbow, as in gathering vegetables and fruits of all different colors so that you get a diversity of molecules from those foods in your diet. I love this diagram going from non-processed to processed from Dr. Lee Frame at George Washington University, and she has a really nice nutrition guide here, where you start from just an apple. If you slice it up, that's the most minimal processing you can do. But the kinds of foods that are available to us coming from apples run this range all the way to, apple flavored gummy bears, which probably don't have too much apple in them. So the goal is to just eat less processed foods. And this has big impact on our systemic health, our metabolic health. And, for example, for our livers, that's a really important thing to note. There's fructose in apple, but it won't have the same impact on your physiology and your liver health if it's in the food matrix of an apple, because the fiber and the other structures in the apple will help that food persist and make it all the way down into your colon to avoid blood sugar spikes and to help your gut microbiome have some of their favorite fuels and so forth. So just as a quick intro to a keto diet, keto diets are often very low carb and high fat and good amounts of protein. So here's an example of what a keto diet shopping list could look like. But you'll see there's still plenty of veggies on there. Trying to eat low carb veggies is really a critical part of a healthy keto diet to make sure you still get all the nutrients and fiber that you need. And you'll see there's a lot of options for how to eat fats that are not only coming from meat. So I want to make sure that this range of nutrients that could contribute to a keto diet is clear. What I hope by the end of this lecture is that you've had some of these questions answered about what is a keto diet, and there's a lot of myths around keto diets, and I'm going to revisit this at the end. Feel free to have a look at these questions and see if you still have them, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end as well. So I'm very happy to answer any of these questions. You know, I have these questions myself when I was first learning about this, and there's a lot of interesting questions about, you know, do you need carbs to thrive? Your brain needs sugar. Where's that sugar going to come from? But, you know, our metabolism has the capacity to convert protein and fat into glucose. So we can keep our brains running without eating carbs. And so anyway, that is the purpose of this lecture, is to help that become clear. The outline of our lecture will be an intro to fats and the keto diet, the microbiome and macronutrients. And then we're going to have some history about the ketogenic diet in the context of epilepsy and diabetes. And then I've got some practical tips, followed by a great set of recipe demonstrations. And again, you can get to the recipes on this website, the SSIHI website. And we're going to learn how to make a few different things: avocado brownies and keto low carb crisp breads and an egg veggie dish. And all of these still will help you get macronutrients and fiber. So I think that's a really nice way to demonstrate how to do that. So just to look at the macronutrients, the main macronutrients are proteins, carbs, and fats. And they have different calorie density. And so in this assessment of how we determine how many calories are in food is very old. We've been doing this since the 1800s. And to be honest, the nutrients we access are affected by the food matrix. Processed foods, we get more calories from them. So I think that's on its own interesting. But anyhow, just we're going to go through some basics about what the different macronutrients are and what kind of foods they're found in. So when it comes to fats, fats are nutrient dense. There's actually 9 calories per gram of fat. And there are saturated fats, which have these glycerol heads and straight fatty acid tails, which make it easier for them to remain solid at room temperature. And then we have unsaturated fats, which have these kinks in their fatty acid tails, which helps them stay liquid at room temperature, like olive oil. And we're in an interesting moment for the trend of eating plant fats. For example, even Starbucks has these new olive oil coffee beverages. I have to admit, I haven't tried one myself, but feel free to ask me or comment in the question and answer session, because I think this trend is kind of interesting. Apparently, people are having some dietary distress associated with drinking these coffee beverages, which is kind of interesting. So we're in a definite moment where people are thinking a lot about how to get fats into their diet in a healthy way in order to have a keto diet. And then, of course, there's long history of fat and nutrition that's really interesting. In the whole mid-20th century, we introduced a lot of trans fats into our diet through manufacturing processes. Those were very processed foods that have been, in some ways, I think actually there's been a success in the public health campaigns in reducing our intake of the trans fats. So, okay, so you've got saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and here's some examples of some healthy keto fats. They don't have to come from animal-based food sources, although they can. I mean, that can certainly be a part of a healthy diet. But just to point out the nutrient content of some of these plant-based fats, you can really get great nutrients from these examples: chocolate, olive oil, avocado, etc. Then the next macronutrient I'd like to talk about are proteins. And proteins are chains of amino acids, and they form just so many important structures in our health. I mean, my whole PhD was focused on just two proteins, but our bodies make, tens of thousands or many thousands, maybe tens of thousands of different proteins. Our cells are chock full of them. They each do different jobs. There's many famous proteins I'm sure you guys have all heard about. Our hair is made actually mostly from protein. We have enzymes that support digestion that are made from protein. So there's 20 different amino acids that each have different side chains, and they fold up into these structures that are really important for carrying out all kinds of jobs in our health. And as far as our diets go, we're often being encouraged to eat more protein, although on average, Americans are doing pretty well when it comes to eating enough protein. I think our fiber gap is a bigger gap than our protein gap. Protein is important for keto diets. We'll get into that more too. And then finally, we've got carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, like proteins, have 4 calories per gram, and they can come from really simple sugars like glucose and fructose, and they can also come from more complex resistant starches or fibers, which are these longer chains of linked sugars that resist quick digestion and make it all the way down to our colon where the gut bacteria live. And I just want to point out, of course, that if you get big blood sugar spikes from eating concentrated amounts of especially quick acting carbs, then you're going to end up with a blood sugar spike and a need for insulin. And that excess sugar can be stored as fat. Our diets right now tend to have a lot of processed carbs in them, but these are both important sources of carbs. The donut or the broccoli, in each case, are loaded with different types of carbs. When it comes to the macronutrients, the different macronutrients each have different impact on our blood sugar. So when you eat quick-acting carbs, this is time going along the x-axis and blood sugar spike going along the y-axis. And if you eat refined carbs, you have a big, quick spike in blood sugar. When you eat more complex carbs, then the blood sugar spike can be spread further out. And to be honest, this curve could go on for much longer. It's not uncommon if you eat a big dinner that you're going to have your blood sugar continue to be affected by the food you've been eating for 2 or 3 or more hours. And then as you can see here, protein, it's not that protein doesn't affect your blood sugar, it's just slower. Our bodies convert protein into glucose through a process we're going to learn about today called gluconeogenesis. And so this red line, you see the protein is definitely affecting our blood sugar. And when you add fat to carbs and proteins, it essentially just slows down this timing. So you can avoid blood sugar spikes by eating mixes of fats with your carbs. But on their own, fats don't tend to lead to blood sugar spikes. So we need to keep our blood sugar as close to normal as possible to remain healthy. And amazingly, so the amount of blood sugar in a healthy person's blood, let's call it 100, maybe it should be 83 or something like that. The amount of blood sugar, if you count it up from the 5 liters of your blood, adds up to just about 1 teaspoon or 5 grams of sugar. So you need 5 grams of sugar in your blood to keep your health going. Your brain, for example, needs access to that glucose. If your glucose levels drop much from there, you'll immediately have really big symptoms, and that's you can't survive with lower blood sugar than that in a very short-term context, like even just a couple hours. So we got to keep that glucose going. So how do we do that? We're not eating carbs every hour. How is it that we have survived? What if somebody is fasting for a week, or what if you're an Eskimo and you've never eaten a carb in your life? How do we keep those 5 grams or the teaspoon of sugar running all the time? So this is a problem our metabolism has figured out. So as glucose stores run out, we convert to using protein and fat to maintain our blood glucose. So if you've been eating glucose or carbs, then that's the initial source of sugar. We also build long chains of glucose called glycogen, and those are stored in our liver and our muscle, and those are quick to access. So we use glycogen, so glycogenolysis, in the first 8 hours or more if we need glucose. And if you've ever heard about a marathon runner hitting the wall, that's the moment when all the glycogen stores of the liver and the muscle have been depleted. And so now there's not an easy source of glucose anymore. When we run out of the food-related carbs and the glycogen stores in our liver and our muscle, then our bodies turn to using protein and fat through this process called gluconeogenesis. And that's a process that can go on for a long time. And I'll have a little more information about this later, but people, for example, with epilepsy have had really big success in improving seizures that were resistant to other types of treatment by eating keto diets. We've known this for a century, and people have lived eating keto diets and they've been healthy. And the reason they can keep their blood sugar up is because of gluconeogenesis. So our brains need about 130 grams of glucose per day. And even people who don't eat any carbs are able to get those 130 grams of glucose. Because low blood sugar is really serious. You need those 4 grams or 5 grams of sugar in your blood to avoid the symptoms of hypoglycemia, which are immediate. And this is a description of the symptoms. And to be honest, it can be quite serious. If your blood sugar goes too low, you won't live. So that's the biggest cause of death in people with type 1 diabetes in a younger age group. So we need this 4 to 5 grams of sugar in our blood at all times. That adds up to about 130 grams per day for our brains. But the glucose can come from carbohydrates or from protein. So it's not that it has to come from ingesting carbohydrates. It could come from protein and fats. And so here's a diagram showing you that the protein can be converted to glucose with gluconeogenesis. And we have fatty acids that can be converted into ketones. And actually, our brain cells can also use ketones to generate ATP. So for a keto diet, we obviously need to explain what ketones are. I'm going to get into that. But anyway, gluconeogenesis that I've just talked about is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate carbon sources. So if you're fasting, if you're eating a low-carb diet, if you're running a marathon and you run out of your glycogen stores, your glucose chain stores, or if you're in a starvation mode, you can convert protein, lactate, and glycerol into glucose. And that process mostly happens in our liver, but also in these other tissues. And so that's kind of a key piece of information to understand how people can get through the day on a keto diet. So we do have kind of amazing carbohydrate storage capacity in our bodies. Most people have about 300 to 400 grams of glycogen in their muscle. And I love this image of the liver packed full of carbs. This comes from a running expert, like a long distance running coach. And people who are trying to run long distances actually work hard to build up their glycogen stores and their fitness for mobilizing those glycogen stores during exercise. So, as you build muscle, you build the capacity to store more glycogen. And actually, that's helpful for reducing blood sugar spikes too. So all of these are useful tips. But anyhow, you're going to have glycogen in your liver and your muscle storing the carbohydrates. Glycogen are just chains of glucose. In order to keep that 4 to 5 grams of glucose in our blood, you can see how you need a reserve to keep this very tight balance going. So ketosis occurs when the glucose and the glycogen stores have been depleted. And normally glucose will move freely across our membranes of our cells, even without insulin while we're exercising. So when you have higher demand for keeping your muscles fueled, the need for insulin goes down. So this is a really important tip for avoiding blood sugar spikes. You can, if you walk for a little while after a meal, for example, that will soften your glucose spikes and it'll just make the insulin more effective. So normally you need insulin in order to help recruit glucose transporters and get the glucose across your cells. But when you're exercising, this process can occur even without the help of insulin. So that's a really important tip if you're in a situation where you don't have enough insulin. So normally our metabolism is driven by, or I shouldn't say normally, but a person eating carbohydrates, which is most humans, a person eating carbohydrates is going to be having glucose rising after the intake of the carbohydrates. Then our pancreas makes insulin and our glucose is used for energy. However, if you're in a state of ketosis, which means that you're eating proteins and fats, but not carbohydrates, you're not gonna be having the glucose spikes after your meals, but you're gonna be able to use the fatty acids to produce ketones. And if you're eating protein, that can be converted to glucose through gluconeogenesis. So there's still access to glucose, even if you're not eating carbohydrates. Here's another image of a ketogenic diet. So here you can see this is actually coming from an epilepsy organization to help reduce seizures in people with epilepsy. And here are examples of healthy fats where you can still keep a very low carbohydrate nutrient profile going, but you've got access to lots of the nutrients that you can get from plants. So here you'll even see chia seeds. As you guys know, I've just done an intervention in my class with chia seeds, and they're even on the list because their carbohydrate content is so low. So in a ketogenic diet, you're eating very low numbers of carbohydrates. It might not need to be quite that low. I mean, there definitely are low carbohydrate diets. In fact, even just defining what these diets are is difficult, and we'll get into it. But anyway, in a ketogenic diet, you have sources of fat that include nutrients and, of course, your body fat. And when you've run out of the glucose and glycogen, then you're in a state of ketosis. That's when ketogenesis starts to happen. And then you have your liver and the other tissues we just talked about busy building these molecules called ketones. So clearly, I better define ketones. So what do we mean by ketones? These are the three main ketones that are produced from fat in our bodies when we are in a state of ketosis. There's acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. These molecules might be familiar to you. Acetone, for example, in nail polish remover. They have a smell that I'm sure everyone has smelled before. It's a bit of a fruity breath smell that occurs. That is you're smelling these molecules when somebody is in ketosis. So somebody who has a hangover or somebody who just ran a marathon might have this smell on their breath. And so how do we measure them? The most common measurement in blood is a measure of beta hydroxybutyrate. And so here's some of the normal levels. If you're eating carbohydrates, the levels will be below 0.6 millimoles per liter, for example. But if you're in medium ketosis, they're a bit higher. And so there's different measures for the different molecules, but I'll leave it at this one, which is the most common one, being measured in blood. So when people say that they have high ketones, that would be measured, for example, in blood to be above 1.5 millimoles per liter, for example. It can get dangerous. So here you'll see this mention of DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis. There's an important distinction between ketosis and ketoacidosis. In fact, I'm going to jump over here because it's simpler. So ketosis is a natural metabolic state process. This probably happens to everybody a little bit in any given month when you haven't eaten for a while and you've run out of glycogen. These are not very high levels. They're not enough to cause a big drop in your blood pH, for example. Ketoacidosis is a medical emergency. And so if your body's not producing insulin, you can end up with very high levels of ketones, and that can actually drop your blood pH. And this is like a go to the ER level medical emergency. And so here's a little bit more information about that. So ketosis, as I've mentioned, is just your body's normal fat burning adaptation to a fasted state. And you can measure this with urine strips as well, actually. So this is something that will happen, especially for athletes who are depleting their glycogen stores, and certainly for people on a low carbohydrate diet. Ketoacidosis does not occur even for people who live on a keto diet for many years. It happens most often in people who have type 1 diabetes or alcoholics. And the reason it's so dangerous is that these molecules are acidic and they can drop the blood pH to dangerous levels that lead to coma or death. So that is definitely something to take seriously. But it's not usually a concern for keto diets. One thing that I think is really interesting is that in the last century, we've trended away from using nutrition to manage health as much as pharmaceuticals became available in the second half of the 20th century. We have more often turned to guidelines that rely upon pharmaceuticals rather than figuring out how to help people have a diet that supports their health. And so here's a really interesting plot of the last century talking about carbohydrate restriction or just guidelines and advice that you get from doctors if you have diabetes related to diet. And so, back before we had insulin, the only treatment if you were developing diabetes was carbohydrate restriction. So this was people were eating diets, just cabbage and things like that, which obviously was not something you could survive with. This was not a good situation, but we were aware that carbohydrate restriction could help reduce the need for insulin. And then since the discovery of insulin in 1922 or 1921, we figured out that you could manage insulin and carbs together. And so it's interesting how just in this last century, we slowly moved away from having advice about carbohydrate restriction and instead emphasizing relying upon pharmaceuticals. So that was how it became so surprising when this paper came out in 2017 or 2018. This paper came out where a group of very committed parents figured out how to keep the blood sugar of their kids with type 1 diabetes almost normal in a way that you didn't even think was possible. They had an enormous success in keeping almost normal blood sugars by eating a very low carbohydrate diet. And amazingly, there's criticism coming even from the American Diabetes Association, thinking that the people would really need carbohydrates to be able to live or thrive. And so that's why I want to share this knowledge that we know that you don't actually need carbohydrates to keep the glucose running for your brain. So here's some more news about that a low carb diet can aid people with type 1 diabetes, and it points to this amazing results of the group of parents who managed to keep blood sugars in almost normal levels by having people eat a very low carb diet. And I have to give a big thank you to Dr. Andrew Kutnick, who is a scientist up at the samueli.institute in Santa Barbara. And he has done a really wonderful job of tabulating how this data and how these trends have affected the capacity for people with type 1 diabetes to manage their blood sugars. And this has big impact for people with any kind of metabolic disease close to type 2 diabetes or overweight or obesity. Anyway, in this group, people are managing to keep these flat lines of their blood sugar by eating very low carbohydrate diets. And as I mentioned, we have a century of evidence for people using keto diets to reduce seizures and epilepsy. And here you can see a 2010 New York Times article about a child in a family that had huge success with this, their life was very affected by seizures and none of the medications that were available were working. And so they've been using a keto diet and had a really big reduction in seizure frequency, which has even been found in larger trials that have been run now. This is some of the first evidence back in 1921 in the clinic bulletin. You can see people were starting to use low carbohydrate diets to help people with epilepsy avoid seizures. And we even know now, this is a microbiome series, so I've got to make sure I include the microbiome. And there's even been research in the last 5 years that have shown us that gut bacteria play a really important role in the anti-seizure effects of the ketogenic diet. So for example, if you grow mice that are not having any microbes and you give them a low carbohydrate diet, it does not help them avoid seizures. But when the microbes are present, especially on the keto diet, then the seizure reduction impact of the keto diet is possible. So this is a big field, but just as you might expect, if you're eating a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, of course, it's harder to keep all the fiber getting to your colon to help feed the gut microbes. But some of the impacts are a decrease in the diversity of the microbes, an increase of mucus-eating bacteria like Akkermansia muciniphila. And then it's not listed here, but I will just point out that you also, across many studies, not just this one, they've seen decreased bifidobacteria, which is the bacteria that's famous for breaking down complex fibers. And that's actually the bacteria that was the most responsive to the high fiber diet studies we've done here at UC Irvine that you may have seen in my previous lectures. Okay, so I should be wrapping this up to give Chef Jess a chance, but I have a few messages I'd like to share. Now I've told you a bit about this keto diet, but how do you define that? How many carbs can you eat and still be in ketosis? What defines a low carbohydrate diet? And thanks to Dr. Andrew Kutnick, who I just mentioned before, I learned that just last week, there was a publication from a council that defined many of these features that we have been finding that there's not really consensus on. So they did their best to make a consensus on what low carbohydrate diets mean and what evidence we have for this type of guidance. And so some of their findings included that there weren't clear definitions, but they defined very low and low carbohydrate diets to mean eating 20 to 50 grams per day for the very low and 50 to 129 grams per day for the low carbohydrate diets. And as I mentioned, your brain needs 130 grams of glucose per day. So these numbers are keeping you below that physiological need to keep the 5 grams of glucose in your blood at all times to feed your brain. And then here's what's defined as higher carbohydrate dietary patterns, as you can see. And here's some examples of the ways you could acquire this type of food pattern coming from different food groups. So of course, you're going to be eating a lot less grains if you're eating a lower carbohydrate diet, like 1 ounce versus 6 ounces here, for example. And there's quite a few other statements about what the future, what information we need to be able to make good decisions about the health of these diets in the future. That future research needs standard definitions of what a low carbohydrate diet is, for example, but that you can still find ways to eat vegetables, fruits, legumes, and beans in smaller amounts to still get nutrient-dense carbohydrates into a healthy keto type of a diet. This brings me back to these myths, which actually I encourage you guys to ask me more about any of these that remain mythical to you during the question and answer period, because I think there's pretty good information about a lot of these different types of questions that people have, like, oh, is it going to hurt my gut bacteria? Well, hopefully you can find a way to still eat some low carb veggies and keep your fiber gap filled. As you guys have heard me talk about before, if you're looking at a nutrition label, you can actually subtract the fiber from the total carbohydrates. So for chia seeds, for example, with 12 grams of carbs and almost 10 of them coming from fiber, that means you can eat a serving of chia seeds and only get 2 grams of carbs. So for example, this recipe for chia pudding can be very, very low carb. This recipe comes from the same type 1 diabetes advocate who wrote a great book that I described in our last lecture, Bright Spots and Landmines. And so he has this recipe that I think he talks about how he has at least 70,000 people who are eating this regularly. And so here you can see how there's a recipe here, and you can see how you could make it with soy milk and just a little bit of yogurt and blueberries, which are also pretty low carb. And this would be a way to have a a healthy breakfast that doesn't spike your blood sugar. So Chef Jess has some great recipes for us, and you can get to the recipes on the SSIHI website. We've got keto low carb crisp bread. I actually just saw it myself in the kitchen. It looks great. We've got avocado brownies and some spinach mushroom egg bake. One more thing I want to show is that avocados are a great source of healthy fat and fiber. Look how much fiber in just half an avocado, 6.7 grams of fiber. So if we're aiming to fill our fiber gap of like 15 or 20 grams, you know, you can get some real progress by eating avocados. So let me just get to my last announcement, which is that we are going to run a intervention with fiber in the spring. And if you're interested, I really welcome you to email me. We're planning a daily chia seed serving plus education in the kitchen on Tuesdays at noon in April and May. And the study is focused on breast cancer survivors. So please email me if you're interested or if you know someone who is. Here are my 5 key takeaways that will also be available on the website, so I will not read them. I want to pass this off to Chef Jess. I'll acknowledge my group who have made all the research in my lab so fun. And we have several more of these coming up this year, so you can find out more on the website. And with that, I will pass it over to Chef Jess in the teaching kitchen.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear? Can you hear? No.
Yeah, we can hear
Oh, you
great.
can. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I was like, you're the only one that can say yes or no. Okay, so let's get cooking. Let's see. You can see my screen. Perfect. Okay, so we're doing 3 recipes. The first one we're going to do is a romesco spinach mushroom egg bake. And it's kind of like, why? I've been on a portobello kick recently. Portobello mushrooms are great. They're very meaty. And so they're a great source of fiber too. And if you're missing meat, it's a great way to get it in. We've made some really good portobello tacos. UCLA has a great recipe. So if you want to head on over to UCLA's website, they have one. But what we're going to do today is we're going to make a romesco sauce. And so like a sauce to go into it. I have 2 bell peppers that I roasted or I charred. We use electric stoves in here. And so it's hard. It's actually very hard. You can't do this on the stove. You need to do it in your oven. So I just turned on my broiler, stuck them underneath my broiler, and then I covered them with a little bit of saran wrap. The saran wrap will create this kind of like steam pocket inside and help you peel off the skin. So I'm just going to take off. I'm doubling the romesco sauce just because you can never have too much. This sauce freezes really well. So you can have it around. It acts like pesto. So if you think about it, it's like pesto without the basil and with red bell peppers instead. That's good. And you can use pre-bought roasted red bell peppers too. They're just so easy to do at home. Might as well do it. So, and some people will ask, can I do this over the sink and rinse it off? You could, but you're losing a lot of that flavor that you worked on. Almost there. And then we're going to add some lemon. I'm going to add a little bit of lemon juice and lemon zest. So I've got a lemon, organic. So this is my thing. If you're going to use the zest of anything, or the peel or the outside of something, make sure it's organic because that's where a lot of those pesticides are going to hang out anyways. So just make sure that if you want to use it, that it's organic. And you don't want too much of the white because the white is bitter. This kind of brightens up the romesco sauce for you. Give it good flavor. You can do more than that. I'm being quick. I'm going to take off my ends. And if you haven't heard me say it once, you'll hear me say it again. If your lemons or limes aren't juicing or they're kind of hard, put them in your microwave. About 20 seconds and it'll help soften them up, especially the organic ones. Sometimes they have big pith on the outside, and so putting it in the microwave helps. And then the most important part of a romesco, just like a pesto, the part that's going to give you the healthy fats and kind of bind everything together, are nuts. So you can play around with whatever nuts you want. You can even use seeds. I was just talking to our other chef, Sarah, the other day about pine nuts. And pesto always used to be made with pine nuts. And pine nuts are expensive. They are not cheap. And it's hard for me to taste the pine nut when there's so much basil and cheese inside. You're using that nut to kind of bind everything together because of the fat inside of it. So use something more neutral or something that you like. I have walnuts, has some omega-3s in there. Hold on, I got a seed in here, and that's not something you want in there. Right. And then some garlic cloves. So I'm using walnuts. I'm going to throw in a few garlic cloves. And if you don't want to use garlic, you don't have to. It really makes it pop, though, gives it kind of that spiciness that you want. So all of that goes inside, and we blend. And so I have a little bit of olive oil, and we're going to drizzle. And that's it. So you've got this beautiful romesco sauce. Oops, I just tripped that in there. That we're going to use now for our mushrooms. So for our mushrooms, portobellos. So they're big creminis. So if you've ever seen those brown mushrooms in the store, they're just mini portobellos. What you need to do is pop off the stem. So just use your thumb and pop it off. And then use a spoon and scrape away at the gills. So the gills, this area, is the part that absorbs the water, that makes you feel like you don't want to wash it. I already washed it, but if you're afraid of your mushrooms absorbing too much water, what you can do is take this part off first and then wash it. They've really done the research, though, and the mushrooms really don't retain as much water as you think when you wash them. So don't be afraid to wash your mushrooms. And then when you're like me and you're left with 3 pounds of extra mushroom, I made mushroom chili today. Just put it in a food processor and let it go. Mushrooms are great because they give you like a nice umami flavor. All right, so let's fill. Let's fill this. So we're going to take a little bit of the romesco and just spread it on the bottom. And you can save like the extra romesco to serve on the side if you have any extra. And you can buy it too. Trader Joe's makes one. And if you don't want romesco, you could use pesto. It's like a canvas that you can play with and do whatever flavors you want. Ooh, I got a whole garlic in there. Somebody's going to get a surprise. I'm not going to do that. Okay, there we go. Now we're going to add a little bit of baby spinach. Okay, you can just tear it up by hand. You don't even need to chop it. Just a little bit of baby spinach. And as much as I want to say this is for breakfast, it can be, you can have this anytime. Okay, a little bit more. And then we get to do the fun part, the eggs. If you've ever done like eggs in the toast or toast eggs or things like that, this is similar. I want you to be forgiving though, because sometimes the portobellos aren't as nice. And if they aren't, dig a little hole in there to help. But what I like to do is I'll actually I'll crack my egg into a bowl and then lay it on top, just like that. Another one, dripping. Go. And then the best part is some fresh basil. Nice. All right, so for the basil, I just wanted to show you really quickly. If you want, yeah, I know you can buy basil packages out there and everything. I'm just going to show you when you can propagate this. So buy it from Trader Joe's. I will say Trader Joe's has the best basil out there. And you want to take off everything up to the second node. So this one's going to stay here. I'm going to take these off, okay? And then I can take this and put this in water. You can take off the big leaves just because they'll start to drain it. But once you get roots that are about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, you can take that and you can plant it in a little bit of soil. So now I'm just going to take my basil and I'm just going to do a rough chop on it. And sprinkle that right on top. Just a little bit. And then the best part, because the keto diet allows a lot of it, is cheese. So there's some cheeses out there that are a lot friendlier than other cheeses and so on and so forth. I'm a fan of mozzarella and a fan of Parmesan. Now, why? Parmesan is nice because a little goes a long way. It's a drier cheese. And so a little bit, the flavor travels. Mozzarella, you can get part skim. And so you can get lower fat ones if you need it. But if you're on keto, obviously, you probably want to go for the other stuff. So, but there's just so many varieties of good cheeses out there. But at the same time, just realize what you're buying. And if you're using Parmesan, you can get away with using less. And there you go. So I'm going to pop this in the oven and keep on moving. Oops. All right. Okay. Why remove the skin? Good source of fiber. What did I remove the skin of? Oh, the bell pepper? You're right. It is a very good source of fiber. You can keep it. The reason why you don't want it in the sauce though is because you end up chewing on it. It gets in the way. So you'll hear me talk about peeling things a lot, and I will always tell you to keep the peel if you can. This is too burned to keep, and the reason why you're doing that is just so that you get a smooth sauce. If you don't care about having a smooth sauce, you can put the whole thing in there then. Nothing wrong with it. So now let's go to our keto low-carb crisp bread. So let's see if everyone can pick out the sources of good fat in here. I challenge you. The challenge is what isn't a fat in here. Just kidding. So we've got some raw sunflower seeds. So you want everything raw because this bakes for a long time. If you were to use things that were toasted or pre-toasted, it tends to end up burning and then it turns bitter. So you want to be careful when you're making this, that you buy everything raw. So I'm going to put sunflower seeds. You can use raw pumpkin seeds too. This is a very, very forgiving recipe. Healthy fat. Hemp seeds. Hulled. They make so much hemp seeds these days that you can buy them everywhere. You can buy up Trader Joe's, Sprouts, anywhere. Sesame seeds. Raw, untoasted. This is a little bit harder to find in large amounts. So you want to go shopping somewhere that has like a bulk bin. Again, healthy fat. And our good old flaxseed. I know most of the time we see flaxseed meal. We are actually going to use the whole flaxseed today. Some people don't like it just because they don't feel like it breaks down. I mean, I feel like it does, even through the food processor. You could use chia seeds too, or you could use a combination of the two. And then psyllium husk. Tiny bit of salt and baking powder. Now, don't add the salt if you want to make these sweet. So one of the things you can do is make them for breakfast and you can add cinnamon instead. So just don't add any of the salt. You could add a pinch if you want, but just add cinnamon and nutmeg or something like that. Oops, excuse me. And you'll get a cool kind of consistency. All right. Oh. So you want this sandy texture. So it's kind of like fine sand. Now you'll see all the flaxseed in there and you'll be like, okay, I'm going to do this again. And you can't. This is what I need you to remember though. I don't know if you can hear me. That's why I'm going to wait a little bit. Okay. All of these seeds have fat in them. How do we make the best peanut butter in the world? By taking the peanut, which is a legume, and blending it. Because there's so much fat in it, it'll actually start to come out and bind together. So if you do this too long, it will actually completely kind of become like a peanut butter kind of texture, which is not what we want. We want a very sandy texture. After that, I'm going to take some water, 2 cups of water. I'm going to let this sit for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, I'm left with a dough. So you actually get a dough out of this. I can pick it up. I can actually roll it around in my hands. And I can flatten it and roll it on out. So if you want to make a crisp bread, make it a little bit thicker. If you want more cracker-like, you can make it a little bit thinner. But the most important thing to remember is to score it before you bake it. I'm going to go one more time. This isn't, I'll show you how much you get out of this recipe in 1 sec. And that's it. Okay, so I'm going to score it. Not cutting down all the way, but just like that. Put it on a cookie sheet and pop it in an oven. When you're done, oops, I got 2 sheets. That's big. And because I scored it ahead of time, I can go in now and just crack it off. Now you can put avocado on this and eat it as toast. Oops. You can put fruit on it if you made it sweet. But this becomes a board for you to add different things to it then. Okay. So it's a really good cracker / flatbread if you wanted it to be that way. So last thing, avocado brownie, because we can't let you out without something sweet. So the avocado brownie, in your recipe, you have it. And I've had a bag of allulose for a very, very long time. Well, no, not a very, very long time. Allulose is a sugar substitute that they are using now. Allulose occurs in very, very, very small amounts in fruits. So like figs, I think, is one of them, but it comes in very small amounts. It's about 70% as sweet as sugar. So that's why you'll see that recipe, it says 1 cup, because it's not as sweet as sugar. So if you're going to use another sugar, reduce it a little bit. It's expensive. It's not cheap. It might get cheaper over time. My thing about it, though, is at the end of the day, unless you know exactly where you're getting your allulose from, you don't know where it's coming from. So there are ways of making allulose synthetically through corn. So you just don't know, because it's not going to write down on the back of the bag that it's synthetically made from corn and not extracted from all these great fruits. Again, it's very rare, and that's why it is so expensive. But at this point, we don't even know what kind we're buying, whether it's the corn synthetic stuff or the real stuff. So if you're okay with using sugar, I'm still a big fan of like liquid sugars, maple syrup, date sugars are also good. So if you want to try that, or do half and half maybe. So let's make our brownie though. And I am going to use allulose. So I've got an avocado, one avocado. And this is where you could measure it if you want, but when you're making a recipe like this, I would say just go for it. The fat is what's going to give you flavor or flavor and texture. So the more of this you add is almost just like I'm adding more butter. So you can't add too much of it, but I'm not going to have you measure it out if you don't want to. Now, if you wanted to, you could. But this is one of those recipes where the avocado, just one avocado, is good. Not the jumbos, please. 2 eggs. So you'll notice we use a lot of eggs in keto cooking. And then I've got a nut butter. So I've got an avocado butter. Not an avocado. I'm so sorry. I didn't say that. An almond butter. Just almonds, nothing else. Almond butter. And that'll help bind everything together. Our cocoa or cacao, which also has fiber. Almond flour. Our allulose. A little bit of vanilla and baking powder. And then we're going to go for it. Now, we all love warm brownies. I will tell you, these are not good warm unless you like avocado flavored brownies. What happens is heat enhances flavors that have fat in them. So what ends up happening is if you eat this hot or like warm, it's kind of avocado-y. And unless you really like that flavor, I would say let it cool down a little bit and then make it. So I'm going to transfer this into a bowl. And I have some chocolate chips, and there's some great sugar-free sugar-free or alternative chocolate chips out there that you can buy. So choose what you like. And again, you could probably add more nuts to this if you wanted. But what I don't think I could have.
Actually, Jess, we can't hear you. Just in the last little while.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Oh, no.
Just for 10 seconds. It's no big
Okay. No, what I was going to ask you is. No. Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you great.
I'm watching. Okay, I'm watching myself. I can see if I'm talking. If the black bean brownies would not have worked out in the keto diet, right?
It just is a matter of quantity. So, if people are eating a low carb diet, less than 100 grams a day, you could definitely have beans in there. You could still eat a cup of beans and stay under that. If you're trying to meet the type 1 grit, manage your blood sugar levels, then they try to keep under 30 grams a day, but they do aim for 30 grams a day. Like less than that can lead to really big insulin resistance, actually. So I think they aim for 6 at breakfast, 6 at lunch, 12 at dinner. So you could have an a black bean brownie with that for sure. And
Sure.
actually another question that came in was whether allulose or sugar alcohols in general count towards the carbohydrate count. And just like fiber, you can subtract sugar alcohols from the net carbs. The net carbs refer to the carbs that will affect your blood sugar. So I would say the allulose, I'm not looking at the allulose label myself right now, but it would not be affecting your blood sugar too much.
And
Yeah.
allulose doesn't have sugar alcohols. And so that was one of the benefits of it. But again, it's still probably made in a not very great way, maybe. Don't know. Got to do your research.
I don't know if it affects blood sugar, so maybe I should eat one of these brownies and see what happens to my liver.
No. All right, so I would pop that in the oven. Let me show you what they look. Let me show you what they look like when they're done. And again, completely cool these down before you try them. Knife. All I'm going to do is cut through just so that you can see how fudgy they can be. If you can. So there are the brownies, crisp bread, and the eggs are almost done. So thank you everyone for hanging out. I'm just going to show you what the eggs look like. Probably a couple more minutes in there, just so that the eggs can set a little bit more. But there you have some great egg bakes that you can eat as well.
Looks
So
good.
thank you. We'll see you next month.
Sounds great.